Welcome all. So today I'm going to talk about the test for Chapter 7, and I also wanted to talk about just a few things that should help with the article critique assignment and the PowerPoint, the final paper. The first one is relative risk. You're probably going to see this reported in the article critiques. We're not going to be responsible for actually calculating these out, but I'm going to show you how to do this calculation just so you understand how this is calculated in the research. And we used to have to do this before we made some alterations to this course. This was a problem for the course. So the idea here is that you have a large group of people, and in this case, half of the group was exposed to high noise, and the other half was not exposed to high noise. And then we are recording the rates of noise-induced hearing loss, and we're trying to see if there is a higher rate of hearing loss among the folks that were exposed to the high noise. And what we're trying to do here is find an association between an exposure and a health outcome. The exposure is high noise, and the potential associated health outcome would be noise-induced hearing loss. Okay, so you can do this relative risk for almost anything. And the way that, again, we're not going to do this whole calculation, but I'll kind of skip down. Essentially, what we're trying to do is show that there were 60 people with noise-induced hearing loss out of the high noise group and 20 in the low noise group. So 20 people with noise induced hearing loss in the low noise group. So they must have had their hearing damage someplace else. Okay, so with this, we just it's just a real simple calculation. 60 divided by 200 and then 20 divided by 200 to find each the risk in the exposed group and then the risk in the non-exposed group. And then you take those two risks and you divide them. So you take the risk of the disease in the exposed, which is 0.3, and the risk of the disease in the non-exposed, which is 0.1, and you come up with a relative risk of 3. So what's important for you is to know that when you see a relative risk and it's above 1.0, that you know that there is a higher risk among the one group that was had the exposure. Okay, and what you'll see is that when they do case control studies, they'll use this. Sometimes they use odds ratios, which is similar. I'm not going to go through that, but it's a similar type of calculation. And just as long as you know that when you see a relative risk or an odds ratios above 1.0, that you know that there is an association between that outcome and that exposure. So this is a little different. This is relative rates. And I wanted to talk about this because oftentimes these rates get reported and they're not quite what they seem. So this is a great example. Obesity rates for young children plummets 43% in a decade. So that sounds like great news, but the issue was that they were using relative rates versus absolute rates. And I go through this whole explanation here, and I will post this just if anybody's interested. It's just an explanation of the statistics. And essentially, what the researchers found was that across all age groups, the obesity rates remained about the same. What they did find is that in the 2 to 5-year-old group, the obesity rates dropped from 14% to 6%. So, in terms of absolute rates, that is a 6% drop. But it's not going to sell any papers. Nobody's going to read an article that said there's a 6% drop in one group. But they switched it over to relative rates, and it seems to be a much bigger reduction. And to do that, you take the percentage of the decrease, which was 6%, 14 minus 8 is 6%, and you divide that by the original prevalence rate of 14. So 6 divided by 14 is 43%. So the relative rate was a 43% drop. So I know that's kind of confusing, or it might be confusing, but the idea here is that oftentimes when you hear these rates, it's not an absolute rate, it's a relative rate, and they do that to exaggerate essentially the effect. And they do this oftentimes for drugs. And what you hear is Lipitor reduces the risk. I'm picking on Lipitor, but we could have done this with any drug. Lipitor reduces risk of heart attack by 36%. And if you look to the small print down here, it says that in a large clinical study, 3% of patients taking a placebo had a heart attack compared to 2% of patients taking Lipitor. So really, that is a 1% reduction. But again, they are able to manipulate it. It's, you know, 2 divided by 3 is 64%. So that means the relative risk reduction is 36%. So they sell a lot more drugs if they use the relative risk number. So just something to be aware of. Another number that the first number you should ask for is, or one of the first numbers, or ask for or look for is, it's called the NNT, the number needed to treat. So how many patients do you need to treat with this drug or this intervention for one person to benefit? So a good drug, it's 3. The number needed to treat is 3 or 4. You treat 3 or 4 people, and one of those people will benefit from that drug. Lipitor and the other statins, their number needed to treat is closer to 60. So if you have, now I'm talking about people that have not had a heart attack. So for patients that have never had a heart attack, but they do have high cholesterol, you need to treat at least 60 patients to prevent one heart attack. And that's one of the numbers. Some of the numbers came up to 100, the number needed to treat being 100. Okay, so lifestyle interventions are much more effective at reducing cardiac risk than just taking a statin alone without getting additional help. So about again, I know I did a thing here about the article critique, but just real quick, it's just much easier for me when I see the reference starting at the beginning of the paper. It's no big deal if it's at the end, but it's just easier that way. And again, just go through and answer each one of these questions with a solid 3-4 sentences. In some of these you might be able to get away with 2, maybe 2 sentences, but certainly not less than that. Okay, no one-word answers, no short, abbreviated one-sentence answers. This research hypothesis, this is essentially one sentence, but it's 25 words in the sentence, so it's a pretty significant sentence. Okay, all right, so that should be okay. And then, real quick, I'm going to go just through the last couple chapters of the textbook, okay? And this should help for Chapter 7 test, which fortunately is our last test, okay? So when they go through all these technical occupations in public health, you can see how big this is. Animal control workers, audiologists, dental hygienists, home health aides. It's huge. It's just a huge, huge field. So, again, it depends what type of field you're talking about. The nutritionist is going to do different than the person working in the lab, which is going to be different than the physicians or the dentists or the people practicing law. So, it's a little bit different, across the board. And, they're putting these kind of selected professional occupations, or the profile, and there's nothing to say that a physician cannot protect somebody against environmental hazards. That's just a matter of having a conversation with a patient about some of the safety issues in their house or exposures to chemicals, things like that. So even though they have these up there, I know that it's kind of hard to nail down exactly what everybody's detailed occupations are. So they go through all the different positions here. I just recommend that you go through these and that you see, of course, now we're seeing that most of these positions, there are going to be increases, but overall the increase is probably going to be less than 10% when they talk about the overall projected growth trends. So there is going to be increases, but probably it's usually less than 10%. Just some different examples. Again, emergency response coordinators, they're going to become more and more important in the coming years for a variety of reasons. We're going to have more storms resulting from climate change. There's potential for more terrorist activity. So emergency response in public health is not just an up and coming thing. It's already been out there, but it's going to be strengthened, fortunately. Which is good news. FEMA, I know they took a lot of heat for the Katrina catastrophe. But they did a much better job in the what was Superstorm Sandy, the big storm that hit New York and New Jersey a couple years ago. So we're seeing improvements in that field. Um, Again, just a different. I'm not going to go through all these. Feel free to read through these, and I'm going to get through that. Again, these are pretty quick chapters, which is why I'm not too concerned about this last test. Future challenges within public health. Without question, the World Health Organization, when they talk about future challenges, number one on their list is climate change, without question. Terrorism, antibiotic resistance is a major concern. There's a few other ones. E. coli. We're not only E. coli, but all these different threats that we're seeing coming from the factory farming system. The American Public Health Association called for a moratorium or an immediate death to the factory farming system. One of the main problems is the E. coli. The cows produce the E. coli as a result of eating corn instead of grass. Monkeypox. I haven't heard too much about those. I mean, it's not, especially when you consider the rates of chronic diseases. Some of these exotic infectious diseases are a concern. We should be concerned. Avian flu and swine flu are probably a bigger concern. TB has not been a big problem in the U.S., fortunately. Although with homeless populations and things like that, we're concerned. Again, easy problems have already been solved. To a hammer, the entire world looks like a nail. So I would say, and this is just the feedback that I get, especially from undergraduates, is that everybody has this idea in their head that the next great public health intervention or the next great medical intervention is going to be in the form of a drug or a pharmaceutical or some type of a genetic manipulation in order to somehow prevent chronic disease. And I just finished putting together a whole course for another school on chronic disease. Chronic disease is the number one cause of death in the United States, and it is all virtually preventable. Eat a healthy diet, make sure you get enough exercise, and make sure you manage your stress. And again, we know this has been well documented. So the biggest threats are really coming from fighting the corporations that are, manipulating public opinion. That's probably one of the biggest concerns, or from the public health front anyway. That's our biggest battle at this point. We're successful in regulating tobacco, at least tobacco advertisement and tobacco sales in the United States. But the next step is now the war on junk food, and hopefully we'll get there. Okay, so I hope this was helpful. Take care.